Welcome to the STARS program, seniors taking active roles in society. And now, here's your host, ANITA FINLEY.
Good morning, Darwin.
Good morning, ANITA. It is great to talk to you. The gardens are all in peak blossoms, and so spring has come to New York City. And I'm delighted to meet it. But I want to get right into my subject. As you know, the world has been mourning the death of the silver fox. Of course, I'm referring to Barbara Bush, and who was one of our most beloved first ladies. But all these tributes have been on television. But I want to share with you this morning some secrets that were not on television.
Okay.
You know me. Well, first, she was born in the most unlikely of circumstances, June 8, 1925, in the maternity ward for unwed mothers in the Manhattan Salvation Army headquarters. Now, what in the world was she being born in there? Her parents were not only married, but very wealthy. But it seemed that every June, her doctor volunteered his services for the unwed mothers, so her mother took her there to be born so she would have the same doctor. So she, even though born into wealth and privilege, she faced life in this ward for unwed mothers. And I thought that was amusing.
Yeah.
And then she also, Barbara often joked that she had a presidential link long before the Bushes. And her real name was Barbara Pierce before she got married. And she was a direct descendant of President Franklin Pierce, who was president from 1853 to 1857. And his vice president was William Rufus King, who was the lover of President James Buchanan, who replaced Pierce in the White House. And the senators called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. And so
this is too much.
From that beginning, she dropped out of college when she met this young aspiring Navy lieutenant. She met him actually at a prom dance for college students in Greenwich, Connecticut, and they were both very, very good looking and at the time, and they fell in love, although they wouldn't marry until after the war. He had a lot of Navy exploits to attend to, including getting shot down, but he survived and came back to marry her, although he was called a mama's boy. He was under Dottie Bush. She was greatly under her influence, and she objected to Barbara at the beginning. She said, "What are you doing bringing home this very overweight, big-boned woman? I wanted you to marry a very beautiful, feminine woman who would help forge ahead in politics with you."
Like Jackie Kennedy, right?
Yeah. Well, John F. Kennedy pulled it off.
Right.
But anyway, it started out badly, and after the war, Bush decided to go to Texas and try his hand in the oil industry, as the world knows. And by that time, they had a 2-year-old son who would also become president. You know, only Barbara Bush and Abigail Adams were both the wife and mother of two American presidents.
You know, I want to just stop you for a minute. This is very interesting because you're right. This was never told about her background. I thought it said she came from a wealthy family.
She did. She did indeed. As I said, she was only in that war because her doctor volunteered his services to the Salvation Army every June.
Huh?
And so to get to their doctor, they had to go take her to the ward, but her father actually became a very famous publisher. I remember as a boy, Red Book and McCall's were two of the most popular magazines in America. And her father was the publisher of both those magazines.
Oh, okay.
And so, but they just wanted to be near the doctor. They could have afforded any hospital they wanted because her parents were very rich. Barbara never was poor. She never was. But you wouldn't know that because in Odessa, Georgia, where they started out with a 2-year-old son, they went to live in a whorehouse.
Oh, my gosh.
Because there was tremendous, it's been the subject of many a movie in the post-war, with all those GIs returning, there was enormous housing shortage. And so the only thing they could find was they had to share this small building with a very active whorehouse next door, and they had to share the same bathroom. And Barbara always got up early and went in and sterilized the bathroom before George used it. And she recalled the story that one Saturday night she was coming home to prepare dinner for George, and this young soldier, looked about 18, saw her entering the house and mistook her for the madam. And he said he wanted a redhead, and he was specifying to her what the woman had to do. And she said, "Young man, go home to your mother." But anyway, she went on from there, and they became millionaire Texans and took over the state. And we all know that. But what we don't know is there were a lot of things going on behind the scenes in that marriage. It lasted for 73 years. And I'm sure that any man and woman who've been married for 73 years have their rough spots. But there was always a third person in that marriage, and her name was Jennifer Flowers.
Really?
Like, Princess Di said during her marriage to Charles, there was always another person in our marriage named Camilla Parker Bowles. And George had a longtime mistress named Jennifer I'm so
When you said Jennifer Flowers, that was wasn't that Clinton's?
Yeah, I misspoke. It was Fitzgerald.
Okay.
There are two Jennifers here. Jennifer Fitzgerald, who was George Bush's mistress, and Jennifer Flowers.
Okay.
In fact, both of those came out during the campaign, where some headline said, if George has his Jennifer, why can't Bill Clinton? But that came down the pike. The Jennifer was, some people said she looked like a younger version of Barbara, and she met Bush when he was the chairman of the National Democratic Committee, and she worked with him. She became his confidential secretary, even though her fellow secretary said Jennifer could not type. And she was then appointed to be his secretary in Beijing when Gerald Ford sent him to Beijing to become the ambassador to China. And Jennifer went with him, and so did Barbara. And they arrived there. They had there only one day before they were sent to Honolulu for a conference, and he took Jennifer with him. And Barbara was well aware of the affair at this time, and so she decided to go visit her family, and she flew back to New York and was gone there for 3 months. She tore up all of George's love letters. And
oh, my goodness. This is amazing.
It was Dottie Bush that finally got them back together again. She said, "I never approved of you as a daughter-in-law, but once you marry a man, it is an abomination and a sin against God to get a divorce." And she persuaded Barbara to go back to Beijing, and she did. And somehow they reached a compromise. It was very strange. Many people who they had already 6 children. One of them died, and maybe their romance cooled by this time. But Barbara was almost. People said she became almost his mother. In fact, as she aged and became prematurely gray, at many events before they became famous, she was often mistaken for his mother. And he was 1 year older, but she looked the age. But the relationship with Jennifer continued when he was made CIA director by Ford. Jimmy Carter came along and fired him, but for a while he was the CIA director. And Barbara didn't get to see him very much. And she later claimed that she entered periods of great depression over her marriage, but she was sticking it out and always being a good mother. No one ever said she wasn't a good mother. A quick sip of coffee. She said at times she thought of committing suicide. She thought she'd run off a side of a steep cliff, or maybe she would even run her car into an oncoming car. But somehow these two remarkable people made an adjustment. But many people, in addition to Jennifer, have often talked about what a roving eye President Bush, the first President Bush, had. For example, Nadine Eckhart, her husband was in Congress, and she said, when the camera wasn't on, she said, George had a very feminine side, a very femme. He was slim and silly and a hopeless flirt, and he was a very cute boy. And I was sort of attracted to him, but it's the way you might be attracted to a gay friend. And but she said, don't be deceived, because when the door is shut, he might come on to you like gangbusters.
I have to wait. I have to stop you. I have to ask some questions about this. How is the press able to control this and contain this, and all this didn't come out? I know you are so incredible about what you know, but you'd think that the press would catch a lot of this, and we never hear it from anybody but you.
Well, actually, it did come out, but I'm amazed it didn't get more circulation. For example, in I even remember the day. It was August 11th, 1992. George Bush was running for president against, he's trying to hold on to his seat with this young governor of Arkansas named Bill Clinton. And of course, all those stories were coming out in the paper about Jennifer Flowers and Bill Clinton. And then I picked up the New York Post one morning, and the second coming headline read, "The Bush Affair." And on the front page was a picture of George Bush and of Jennifer, his mistress. And he was called his office wife in the story. And it detailed a very interesting and provocative article on the mistress. In fact, in Washington circles at private parties, invitations often went out to President Bush and Miss Fitzgerald. And of course, Barbara knew all about this. And that caused some tension when Bush was vice president and Reagan was president. Nancy never liked Barbara. In fact, they were two very different types. And so any gossip that Nancy Reagan found, she liked to spread around Washington social circles. And this really angered Barbara. Now, Barbara, on most occasions, could be quite polite in public, but Nancy just infuriated her. And she said, "Who is Miss Reagan to talk in the late 40s, she was known as the fellatio queen of Hollywood. So
Oh
they
my
had,
gosh. I want everyone to
I
know
think,
you're listening to Darwin Porter, of course, who is this famous celebrity writer. And we have a fabulous book that has just come out, by the way. I love the book. You are just so amazing. Oh my goodness. But keep doing what you're doing because it's so appropriate now since we just did attend the funeral by television. But it is a wonderful thing. The new book is The Greatest Mother-Daughter Act in Show Business. And of course, you will see that. And that's his new book, which is about Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds. And you'll see it on the cover. The book is on the cover of our upcoming May issue. But go ahead and continue because this is very enlightening for me.
well, I think what's interesting is how the media will focus on one affair and ignore the other. And now you have to realize that Bush came along at a time when presidential affairs were not written about. Only in the underground press did you ever hear anything about John F. Kennedy and his. I think he had more affairs than anybody. And then later on, after his death, it came out. So Bush, for a long time, operated under the radar screen. For example, there was this blonde from North Dakota. She divorced her husband and came to Washington just to be with him. And then when he was vice president during one night, he and this another, I think he liked blondes, another blonde attended this party, and he was actually driving his car. I think they'd had too much to drink, and they crashed. And the Secret Service rushed to the scene to rescue him and hustle the blonde off. So it never made the wire services. And on yet another occasion, on Connecticut Avenue, there was a fire broke out in the building where Bush was visiting this young lady, and the fire department was immediately called, but the Secret Service blocked the entrance to the burning building until they could get Bush and the blonde out the back door. So that there were a lot of those run-ins, and again, but as I said, it ultimately did make the press. And at Kennebunkport, Bush brought out his entire family and faced CNN and the reporters, and they were asked about his affair. And he said, "This is the most disgraceful question I have ever been asked." And maybe it was, but as we know, Bill Clinton did not get off so easily, did he?
Nor is Trump.
Yes, nor is Trump. But another thing, though, and I think this was a sad ending on the publicity of George H.W. Bush and Barbara, because in this day of the Me Too movement and the sexual harassment, in the final hours of Barbara's life, all of these women started coming forth, telling the press about how the former president inappropriately groped them, and always heading for the derriere, apparently. And at least 7 came forth. And actually, the former president didn't deny it. He admitted that he did, but he apologized for inappropriate behavior. And I thought it was just sort of a sad ending to what was really a long-term love affair that founded a dynasty, although she never wanted George Bush to run for governor of Texas, and she didn't want the former governor of Florida to run for president. But she was a real trooper. She was always family first. I saw her with that walker hobbling around Vermont, supporting Jeb's candidacy, and then he was attacked as a mama's boy, and then President Trump, or the future President Trump, made a lot of digs at her. But at that time, digs to Barbara Bush wouldn't mean anything, because by then she had become a legend and a national institution, and she was above the fray. and I admired her greatly. And nothing I said on this show detracted from her for being a steadfast wife through thick and thin and a fabulous mother. But she did suffer long, long bouts of depression, and she was often, even though she had a big family, she was often locked away. But she was a great champion of literacy, and more than that, I think she's an enduring legend. But sometimes her men gave her a bit of a rough time, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, I have to also say that as a first lady, though, I really respected her. I didn't know much about her, as you've been saying, but I think that we were never ashamed of her as a White House, the first lady.
Never. She, her mother-in-law, Dottie, said, she always urged her, she said, you don't have to be Nancy Reagan worrying about what she's going to wear every day. But she said, if you wanted to, you really wanted to, you could make yourself more attractive to George. I mean, you could take off 30 pounds and you could wear designer clothes. God knows you can afford it. And I think you should also dye your hair brown. And through it all, Barbara said, no. She said, actually, I have concluded at this point in my life that my husband needs a mother more than a wife.
Well, I heard the story, and I guess you know that story, that when her daughter died, her hair turned white. You knew that during that.
Yes.
And then she decided she would just keep it that way, I guess, as a situation for her daughter. I don't know.
Yes, it is. I checked that once medically, and there is a case where people undergoing great stress.
Yes.
Well, of course, they say nobody goes in the White House. You may have, except Ronald Reagan. No one goes in the White House unless they turn sort of gray by the time.
No, but I've heard that also. I absolutely have heard where I have a friend actually who lost a daughter and her hair turned a different color. But I guess we've had it, and I have to just thank you. I always look forward to being with you, and there's so much more we should talk about, but thank you for enlightening us. This was extraordinary. Well, I don't think anyone has ever heard this about a Barbara Bush, so thank you.
I think you heard some things you didn't hear on TV.
Absolutely not. And I had so many more questions, but we never have enough time. We ought to have just 3 hours of Darwin Porter. I could love that.
Well, we could do it. So you have a great show today.
Thank you, Darwin.
Talking to you.
Take care of yourself, okay? Bye.